Hi, I wanted to give you guys a review of the Chapter 11 materials. And we're going to be talking about nutrients that are involved in bone health. We're going to look a little bit about the structure of bones and how bones grow and look at some of the different nutrients that are involved, such as calcium, phosphorus, vitamin D, magnesium, and fluoride. So the bone structure is really made up of three different parts of the bone. The connective tissue that covers all the bones is the periosteum. The cortical bone is the compact or dense bone that's found on the outer surfaces of bones, and the trabecular bone is that less dense, kind of spongy-like structure that's the inner layer of bones. Inside the bone, there's also bone marrow. Sometimes you hear about bone marrow because red blood cells are made in bone marrow. Bone marrow also contains stem cells. Here's a picture of the bone structure, and it kind of shows you the trabecular, the spongy open lattice bones, the marrow cavity, the cortical bone, the periosteum, right up this connective tissue here. We have bones that change all the time. We break bone down and we remake bone almost all the time. Most of our bone is made, though, by the time we're 30 years of age. So after that, we have to kind of just rely on what we built. It's kind of like a retirement plan. You kind of need to pay into it so that when you retire, you have adequate funds to pull from. Bone is about 65% minerals, which those minerals are the ones I just talked about: calcium primarily, phosphorus, magnesium, and fluoride. And what I just spoke about was called peak bone mass. So again, we can build bone until about the age of 30 years, and then after that, we basically live off the bone that we've built. And after 30 years of age, the reabsorption of bones happens at a faster rate than we build bones. And that's why after 30 years of age, you start to lose bone mass and bone density. This talks about two cells that we have in our body called osteoblast and osteoclasts. Okay? Osteoclast breaks bone down, osteoblasts build bone up. So what are some of the factors that influence our bones' health? Women typically have a lower bone mass and bone density than men, and that's primarily because women are smaller. Men tend to be larger in size, thus they have more muscle mass, and as more muscle mass pushes on bones, bones develop greater. So the heavier you are, the actual higher amount of bone density you have. Age, again, after 30 years of age, you start to lose bone mass. Individuals of Caucasian and Asian heritage have typically poorer bone health because of their size. Okay. And then frame size. People with small bones tend to have a lower bone mass. So what are some of the lifestyle factors that influence the health of our bones? Diet, obviously, is one of them. Okay, we're going to talk about nutrients like vitamin D and calcium. Healthy body weight. Now, a lot of times we talk about people being overweight and the risk factors that has, but in bone health, having a low body weight is actually a risk factor. Normal menses, so having women who have regular menstrual cycles, have regular hormonal cycles, thus have healthier bone mass, and that has to do with the hormone estrogen. When you put weight on your bones, those bones become healthier. So weight-bearing physical activity can definitely be a predictor of bone status. So meaning you'll have higher bone mass if you participate in weight-bearing activities. Smoking lowers estrogen levels, and that lowered estrogen levels is kind of the same thing up here as the menses. You definitely will have a lower bone density if you are a smoker. Some medications like steroids, thyroid hormones can stimulate how much calcium we lose in the urine. Some things like alcohol and high intakes of caffeine, diuretics, can increase the risk of losing magnesium in the blood. We talked a little bit about the excessive intake of protein in Chapter 6, and I want to reiterate that one of the problems in bone health is that even if you get adequate calcium, if you're not utilizing it, it's not being able to build bone. And we see this in people who have high intakes of protein. When you have a high intake of protein, remember there is no way to store that nitrogen, and thus that nitrogen has to be made into urea and then excreted out. And what happens is that when you have a high intake of protein, you lose a lot of calcium in your urine. What's interesting too with that is that phosphorus, if you have a high intake of phosphorus, you tend to lose calcium in your urine. And what's interesting is that soft drinks are associated with a high phosphorus intake. So you almost see this inverse relationship of not getting adequate calcium because people are not drinking milk and eating dark green leafy vegetables. They're drinking diet sodas. And the phosphorus causes more calcium excretion, but then you're not even getting the calcium because you're not drinking the milk. And then when we, the last slide talking about adequate UVB, this is ultraviolet light. We need sun every day on our skin without SPF, about 10 to 15 minutes every day to make sure we get adequate vitamin D, which regulates the absorption of calcium. Osteoporosis is the disease that is caused by a low bone density, and what happens is that trabecular bone becomes more porous and has less structural component. In the United States, about 9 million women and 2 million men, 2.8 million men are affected by osteoporosis, which typically leads to a fracture. Again, men tend to have lower rates because they have more bone mass. The problem with hip fractures is that depending on the age, people lose their mobility, they lose their independence, they have increased long-term care, and there's a significant association with increased mortality rates. Okay, this is kind of an indicator of bones health's economic impact, and as our population is aging, what we're seeing is that more people are having osteoporosis resulting in fractures, which results in increased healthcare costs. So it's going to be a significant player in healthcare. I'm not going to go through the osteoporosis calcifications. I think this is a good example of why it's so important to have adequate bone density before you're 30 years of age. Because if you look at this slide, what you see is that this is age down here, okay, of the woman. And here's two different women. So this woman A, she gets really, she builds those bones nice and dense in those first 30 years. So the normal process of aging and the loss of bone is not going to really push her into the osteoporosis or low bone density area. But if you don't build adequate, by the time you're 50, you're going to be having that curvature of the spine, and that also can happen in the hip and the wrists, which results in the increased fractures. There's a picture of that. And again, this just shows as those bones lose their trabecular structure, they tend to be more compact, and that causes curvature in the spine. How do we measure how healthy someone's bones are? It's done with a DEXA scan, which is a dual energy X-ray absorption. And it takes about 20 to 30 minutes to scan the whole body. And what it does is it allows you to measure something called a T-score, and it shows you when your bones are not dense. People should have DEXAs at women over 35 and women over 65 and men over 70, but sometimes women that are younger may need to have those if they have risk factors. Also perimenopausal, which is starting at about 45, with low body weight and have had any problems with fractures or on high-risk medications should get it done. All right, let's talk about some of these nutrients. Okay, calcium and phosphorus are minerals, and I always delineate minerals can be found on that periodic table of the elements, where vitamins are not on the periodic table of the elements. So these are the minerals that are most important in bone health. So let's go through each one. Calcium. The reason that calcium is so important is for a lot of reasons. Blood clot formation, muscle contraction, lots of cellular metabolism. Beyond its benefits, we know that when people have increased intakes of calcium, they have lower bone fractures because they build a stronger trabecular bone. The other interesting thing is calcium can actually lead to a decreased risk of colon cancer, decreased risk of kidney stone formation, decreased risk of lead absorption, and decreased blood pressure. So these are all really important aspects. What happens if you don't get enough calcium? Your bone, especially the trabecular bone, does not become dense. Osteopenia, which is a spongy bone, then the porous bone, osteoporosis, and you have an increased risk of fractures. The RDA, the recommended dietary amount, is 1,000 milligrams a day for both men and women. If you're over 51, you need a little bit more. Pregnancy does not require any extra calcium. Okay, women who are pregnant tend to absorb more calcium, so they actually don't need any more because their body will absorb it better. But as you can see, men tend to get that calcium and women don't, and I call this the Diet Coke syndrome, in that women typically will choose to have Diet Coke or a non-calorie containing beverage with a meal, where a lot of men will tend to have milk. And you see this primarily in the teenage years, and this is a great example. This graph shows what happens to calcium intake. So on this side we have calcium intake, and on this side is the age in years. And so what we see is that green is the boys and blues is the girls. So boys and girls have pretty similar intakes until they're about 8 or 9. And then right around pubescent, so between like maybe 9 and probably 14, the boys start to get a little bit more. The girls are a little bit more, but not much. But then you see this big jump in adolescence. And again, I call this the Diet Coke factor, is that boys are home drinking gallons of milk and girls are worried about their weight and starting to drink Diet Coke. And then their intake just falls off after that. This orange indicates where the DRI is, and you can see that during pubescence, neither boys or girls are getting the amount that they need. How is calcium absorbed? Again, you have higher absorption rates when you're pregnant or lactating, and you have great absorption when you have vitamin D present, lactose present, and acidic environment in the stomach. You have a decreased absorption when you have a high amount of phytic acid. And what's interesting is phytic acid and oxalates are very high in dark green leafy vegetables. So even though they are a significant source of calcium, you're actually not able to absorb all that you're getting because of the binding of the phytates and the oxalates. Where do we get it? The best sources are dairy sources: milk, yogurt, cheese. Non-dairy sources have some, but they're not absorbed as well. Okay, this gives you a little idea of how much you need. 2 cups of yogurt a day, 2 servings of milk or fortified juice is pretty close to what you need every day. So that's where my plate of 2 to 3 servings a day. I'm going to skip through a few of these. Let's talk about phosphorus. Phosphorus makes up of something called the hydroxyapatite, which contributes to the strength of teeth and bone. It is also part of RNA and DNA, and obviously the primary component of ATP. P is the phosphorus in ATP. What happens when do we see phosphorus deficiencies? Sometimes we see it in preterm infants, vegans, alcoholics. And phosphorus, the adult consumption usually meets the needs. And it's in so many different foods, we really don't worry about people getting adequate phosphorus. We do worry about people getting too much phosphorus because that high intake can lead to tissue calcification, and that upper limit's like 3 to 4 grams a day. All right, vitamin D. Vitamin D is produced in the skin naturally when the skin is exposed to ultraviolet light. Keep in mind that that ultraviolet light has to be unprotected, meaning sunscreen can't be on that. Cholesterol is actually the precursor to vitamin D, and that's one of the reasons why cholesterol is not essential, is our body can make that. Vitamin D is also a hormone because the role of vitamin D is to tell the body how much calcium to absorb. And the vitamin D that is produced in the skin is activated in the liver and kidneys to put it in its most active form. So you can see that it's in the skin, the sun hits the skin and moves it from this form to this form, And then in the liver, it's activated into the calcitrol, which is the most active form.